In this video, we're taking a look at 20 of some of the most influential women authors in literature. I wonder how many of these you've actually heard of. So, without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? The first up is Pearl S. Buck. She's an American writer who lived in China, in the Anhui province. Now, she actually learned Mandarin and the ways of rural Chinese village life before she even learned English. Her most famous work is The Good Earth, which follows the story of Wang Lung and the rise and fall of Wang Lung in an unflinching, detailed, moving and empathetic tale. She would later write Dragon Seed, which focuses on the Japanese invasion of China and its effects. But she also wrote East Wind. This takes a look at the difficulties in interracial marriages between Chinese and American in a household. She was the first American author to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, and Good Earth sold millions of copies worldwide. She also set up Welcome House, which is the first ever international adoption agency, putting into practice her belief of understanding people's different cultures and accepting everyone for who they are. Our second writer is Qurratulain Hyder. Now, Hyder wrote River of Fire, an immensely well-known book across South Asian studies. Whether you're studying in Karachi or all the way over to Kentucky, you'll probably come across Hyder's work. She spent a long time researching ancient texts, medieval texts and folklore, and then began to weave together this great epic narrative across 2 millennia. With shifting narratives, changes in dialect as time moves on. Hyder also wrote plays for All India Radio, and she works on dissolving the boundaries of communal and colonial setup. And like I say, if you're going to get into South Asian studies, this is one of your core texts to go to, an extremely influential writer. It's been said that Hyder's River of Fire is the Urdu 100 Years of Solitude, and you've probably all heard of that work because of its remarkable influence. Well, so is River of Fire. Third in our list is undoubtedly a very influential writer, and that is Jane Austen. Jane Austen is magnificent in her wit, but her economy of style comes after books like Richardson's Pamela and Sterne's Tristram Shandy, great tomes, but Austen, she manages to condense everything down so well. She gets entire social structures and worlds built in a much smaller space, developing great characters and making a mockery of things as well. It's said that she actually wrote her first novel and read it to her family when she was 14, and by 21 she had pretty much down the main outline and thrust of Pride and Prejudice, and would go on to write the other 5 novels excluding Sanditon, which makes her so famous today. Her efforts with free indirect speech, where the narrator slips in to the character's thoughts, or the thoughts of the character slip over the narrator's voice, is just masterful, influencing huge, big character writers later, such as William Thackeray, for instance. So that's number 3, Jane Austen. Fourth up is Nella Larsen, whom you've likely heard of. Born to a Danish mother and a West Indian father, she grew up in Chicago and would later enter the Harlem literary circle. Now, she's most famous for her work Passing, but her debut novel was Quicksand, which follows Helga Crane on her wanderings through Copenhagen and later Harlem. But it is Passing that really puts her on the map. In that story, she follows the lives of 2 light-skinned black women and how racial identity shapes the course of people's lives, even breaking their own idea of selfhood in a very difficult Jim Crow era. What's interesting about Larsen is after writing, she suddenly decided to leave publishing and entered the New York Public Library. Her works were forgotten until the 1980s when they were rediscovered again, and now are like foundational in Afro-American courses of literature and even in just purely the modernist movement of literature, focusing on her particularly crisp and direct style of writing. So that was number 4, Nella Larsen. 5th on our list is the well-known, highly regarded and provocative Georges Sand, which of course is Amandine Dupin. She goes by the nom de plume of Georges Sand because of the prejudice or the bias against female writers of the day in France. Her key work, I mean there are a number, but The Devil's Pool may be the most famous of them all. But what makes her most provocative is the way she just disregarded social norms and taboos and blazed the trail of kicking against constrictive boundaries. So, for instance, she wanted to stay in an open marriage with Frédéric Chopin, the classical musician. She wore men's clothes and, shock of all shocks, she smoked cigars in public. I mean, can you imagine? She wrote quite a number of other novels. Indiana is the one I'm familiar with, which is a very no-holds-barred skewering of arranged marriage. She writes Consuela, that's a female artist in the opera house. But famously, and I haven't read this, her biography, My Life I think she calls it, apparently is one of the most fascinating biographies you can read, with all of her bohemian eclectic mix of friends and artists and avant-garde thinkers. So that's 5th place, Georges Sand. Actually, let's say Amandine Dupin, because I'm sure she would have preferred not to have to use a male nom de plume and to be judged by talent alone. In 6th place is Doris Lessing, whom you may have heard of. Now, Lessing was born to British parents in Persia back in 1919, 1920. Anyway, when she was 5 years old, they moved to southern Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, but was a colony of the British Empire still. And here, using her growing up and her experiences in a colonial country, she writes her most famous book, The Grass is Singing, where one Mary Turner is the main person at the centre of a story. She's actually a white woman who's been murdered by one of her black servants. And this actually startled a lot of European readers at the time. But what happens is she captures that colonial heat and racial tension that's going on, also tension in marriage as well, through this very emotionally immature character, and gives a voice to topics which just weren't really being talked about. Now, after this, she ended up moving on to write a whole 5-book set, Canopus in Argus, I think it was called, and that's all about empire and stuff across the galaxies. So it just shows that a writer can do the obsessively intimate, but then also swing to the galactic, the intergalactic expanses, which is rather remarkable. And in 2007, she received the Nobel Prize for Literature. In 7th place is a writer who I'm so pleased to have stumbled upon in my research for this video, and it is Clorinda Matto de Turner. She's a writer from Peru, and if my research is correct, she wrote this book in 1889, and it's called Birds Without a Nest. It's a book of social justice and raising awareness of the horrible plight of the indigenous peoples of the Andean mountains, who were being exploited by the landowners, the political elites, and the Catholic Church. When she wrote this book, it was banned. You know, it was a toxic book as far as the elites were concerned, but not content with just that. She also had to leave Peru. She was pushed into exile. She'd started off as a teacher, become a journalist, and yet used that imaginative and journalistic angle to draw the plight of her people through story. And she would actually inspire other social justice reforming writers, like Jose Maria Aguedes, to write their books as well. And in that sense, she gives a voice to the unheard, to the downtrodden, and joins that great pantheon of reformers who did their work by evoking the plight of indigenous peoples or downtrodden peoples through story, making them come alive, helping the reader to feel what those people might just be feeling. In 8th place is a really influential writer, and it's Zora Neale Hurston, most famous, of course, for writing Their Eyes Were Watching God. But she does write other things like Moses, Man on the Mountain. She has a memoir. However, with Their Eyes Were Watching God, it's not just about race identity. There's so much goes on in that book when you watch Janie through the course of her life, and I don't want to give any spoilers away, but looking at the idea of marriage as well, of communities of colour, the place of money and not having money, all weaves together, and the inherited history that comes before a character. But one thing that Hurston really does well is she elevates the black vernacular to a form of art using the dialect so that the reader can become fully immersed. Now, her works went into obscurity, and I think it was only in the 70s that Alice Walker, she found Hurston's works and began to promote them more and make them more recognised. And her works have gone on to influence the literary arts significantly because of that. She actually had her degree in anthropology from Howard University, and went collecting lots of folklore tales from the Deep South, which informs a lot of her characters and the description of atmosphere, and she binds all of her scholasticism with this amazing ability to tell story as well. So that was number 8, Zora Neale Hurston. The 9th writer on this list is certainly the oldest, but arguably, as we'll see, the most influential of all the writers on this list, and it is Murasaki Shikibu. I can't pronounce Japanese names, so I've butchered that, but anyway, it's not actually the writer's actual name, it's a descriptive name, but we know that this is the woman who wrote the tale of Genji, like the foundational piece of literature in Japanese writing, and took some of the stories of her time, some of the classic writings of Japanese history, but put in a certain psychological element. She developed different narrative styles, such as multiple perspectives, and then poetic interludes would be involved in that as well. This writer, Shikibu, was part of the Heian Emperor's court, and she details lots of different accounts of love and power and envy and all that kind of stuff, and impermanence. She also introduces the idea of seasonal motifs as well. The reason she's so influential is because for centuries so much is written based upon this work, The Tale of Genji, and you can't divide it away from how Japan came to see itself, and actually broader in all of the sort of Asian area, Southeast Asian area. A lot of what people identify with the Japanese culture, including the West, comes really right back to this work. This is a demonstration of how literature, even though it may not be true in the sense that it's fiction, influences the way we see ourselves, the way cultures develop. If anybody ever says there's no point to fiction, there's no point to story, there's no point to this, that and the other, I mean, The Tale of Genji should kick that idea into touch. It's not that it isn't based on truths, but nonetheless the way it's crafted is in the style of a fictional form, and yet it's responsible for spawning all kinds of art, philosophy, ideas, social mores, and even to this day, what people identify with. The 10th author on this list really fascinates and intrigues me. I'd not come across her before, but I'm certainly going to get one book in particular. Now, the writer is Anne Petry, who influenced later writers like James Baldwin and Toni Morrison. I mean, you've got to be good to do if they look to you as their inspiration. So Petry herself, she was a journalist and uses that ability that many a journalist has used to become novelist, of being able to capture quickly the description of a place, the atmosphere of a place, the sensation of that a character may be experiencing. In her most famous work, which is called The Street, and it's the one I want to get, she follows the life of a single black mother in World War II era Harlem. Her name's Lute Johnson, and looks at the difficulties of racism in the housing setup and housing associations, sexism as well within her community. And Lute apparently wants to live by the maxims of Benjamin Franklin and believes if she does that and saves hard-earned money, she'll be able to leave the rat-infested tenements that she dwells in for a better life. But how naive is that? Well, have to read the book to find out. She also writes other works as well. I think it's supposedly a children's book, Harriet Tubman, Conductor of the Underground Railroad. You can even see interviews with her on YouTube as well. And like I say, became a very influential voice for later writers. So that was number 10, Anne Petry. In 11th place is the Swedish writer Selma Lagerlöf. Now, Selma Lagerlöf is extraordinarily influential. Probably her most famous work would be The Adventures with Nils, which she was actually assigned the task of teaching children geography, but wrote this account of a young boy who shrinks to the size of a sparrow, is carried around by geese. And, you know, the book is then travels and geography along with folklore and myth and moral lessons. One of the things about Lagerlöf is her understanding of old folklores and myths, which seems to be at the root of a lot of great storytellers. But she cemented Scandinavian literature, fairy tale literature in particular, as a real strength in the world, the world of fantasy. She even inspired writers such as J.R.R. Tolkien. That's no mean feat, is it? But on top of that, she was a great activist for women's rights as well, and would travel through Europe giving lectures and trying to help women gain certain rights and working rights as well in Scandinavia. She was the first female author to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature, and her writings and the atmosphere of her writings have permeated via other writers all the way around the world. So, I mean, talk about an influential writer. In 12th place is the Spanish writer Emilia Pardo Bazán. I'm going to say Bazán because I've been told the Z is like a TH pronounced in Spanish, but I might butcher it anyway I pronounce it. Now, I've talked about Bazán before on this channel, particularly The House of Uyar, which is probably her most famous work. Now, Bazán herself was a Galician aristocrat's daughter, but she was very drawn and interested to the naturalist movement of literature, chief of whom would be Émile Zola in France, and whom she translated lots of his works. Naturalism is an offshoot of the realist movement. You think of realism as not shying away from the everyday. Naturalism will go down to the gritty part of the days. So in Bazán's works, you'll find depictions of dilapidated and damp estates, oppressed peasants, suffering, clashes between classes of people. The church is often in there, not always in the best kind of light because of its immorality, and desires as well, which are maybe taboo, which we shouldn't have and look down on religiously. But the naturalist school, of course, tries to eschew all of that. And so Bazán writes The House of Uyar. It's very influential. She translates Zola's works. She writes about naturalism in the novel. She's a sound critic of literature. You know, there's a lot to be said about her influence on Spanish writing. And, you know, she held salons as well. She had an influence, along with the great writers of her time, in developing the moving forward of the novel, which of course moves into the modernist novel, developing the novel as we know it more commonly today from the old strictures of the 19th century forms of writing. In 13th place is a writer who I actually know their best work, never read it, but they kept appearing in my research of the most influential writers in literature. And it's Miles Franklin, the Australian writer, who at 16 wrote the book My Brilliant Career. And I'm trying to remember the protagonist's name, Sibylla, isn't it? Who rages against convents and governesses and spinsterhood and gentility, you know, all the forms that is sort of the Edwardian age, isn't it? Franklin herself, she got away from her own strict governess upbringing and went over to London, where she hung out with none other than characters like Joseph Conrad and Henry James. So you've got some serious clout input-wise for literature there. She would later write another book, All That Swagger, which chronicles 4 generations. That's no mean feat to anyone to write a book that chronicles several generations of a pastoral Australian family in New South Wales, and that apparently hints at her own upbringing. What makes her so influential is not only the audacity of a young girl at 16 to pen this book and to decide that she's not going to be held back by the conventions, but she also established the Miles Franklin Literary Award, which encourages other Australian writers to this day. It's one of the most prestigious awards you can get in literature in Australia. And so her influence is felt further forward. Now, I had a friend who recommended to me My Brilliant Career, saying it's wonderful, but I'd forgotten about it. And doing my research, it's been wonderful being reminded of this one. So that one's gone on my wish list. Please tell me if you've read My Brilliant Career by Miles Franklin. In 14th place is a writer who is seriously influential, one of the greats. And whether you like her style or her works or not, you can't deny her innovativeness, her intelligence, her ingenuity. It is Virginia Woolf. She transformed literature, the way she took on stream of consciousness and slips in narrative through different minds. You think of Mrs. Dalloway chopping between the various characters and how they just are seeing the world almost on a live reel, live time. She wrote Orlando, she wrote the complex The Waves, she writes To the Lighthouse. And then, of course, her last book, Between the Acts, set on the village green. What I love about that is it focuses on how stories shape communities. It's so true. But not only was she an interesting writer, avant-garde, and a great thinker, she set up a publishing company. It was her and her husband that published T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Isherwood as well, she published him. She wrote lots of literary criticism. She wrote A Room of One's Own, which is fantastic. She gives us an insight into just how Friends and other literary characters behaved and acted. She's friends with Forster. And how that charged her own development as a writer. Virginia Woolf, as tragic as her life is, as on the literary scene, there's not many people in all history that really put their mark on literature the way Woolf did. In 15th place is the Indian author Kamala Markandaya. Now, most famous of Markandaya's works is Nectar in a Sieve, which chronicles the story and the life of the Indian village wife, Rukmani, as the world changes around her and her little community through drought and through debt and through this rapid industrialization that's taking place in India around the towns, the cities, and affecting life in the villages. In fact, it's one of my favourite themes in all literature is the sudden surging clash of modernity against tradition, the old ways, and how it almost disenfranchises people from their own past, how they're demanded to change quicker than is really reasonable, and how modernity can sometimes be accepted with all of its negatives unthinkingly, and tradition being shoved out though you want to hold on to some of its blessings. Markandaya belonged also to the Royal Society of Literature in London, wrote other works around industrialised towns. This isn't an unusual thing. You think of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. This is a traumatic experience, the rapid industrialisation of places. Some Inner Fury was a work as well, which is about the partition of 1947 India, and the complexities and the difficulties that brought along. But Kamala Markandaya, she really champions women's working rights and the plight of the worker, and used her platform to really influence people's perspectives on those things as well. So a really influential writer. In 16th place is another French writer, this time Sidonie Gabrielle Colette, nearly always referred to as just Colette. Now, literary-wise, she started out as a ghostwriter for her husband's wartime memoirs, First World War. But she wrote a book called Claudine at School, which unexpectedly became this bestseller and launched her onto a literary career. Her most famous work, probably or novel, being Chérie, which describes the story of a courtesan and a coming-of-age story in the Belle Epoque Paris. But not only this, she was also a journalist. She wrote theatre reviews. She wrote food critiques, which are rather important in France, as you can imagine. She also wrote one of the most highly acclaimed memoirs, biographies of Marcel Proust. She was the first female author ever to be admitted to the Académie Goncourt, which is highly prestigious, set up, in opposition to the Académie Française. And she was very well beloved amongst the avant-garde circles that she was introduced to by her rather libertine husband. She had a love of cats. She was apparently very outspoken, and she simply captured the essence of joie de vivre on her pages. One thing that I loved that was written about Colette was that she uses a sparse, tactile prose that is so vivid you can almost smell the perfume. That's just a phenomenal way of summing up someone's writing, isn't it? So that was number 16, Colette. In 17th place is Harriet Beecher Stowe. And I thought I couldn't leave Beecher Stowe off this list, considering the impact that her work had. And we're talking primarily of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She actually wrote that book in Cincinnati, which is near the slave state of Kentucky, and she met numerous escaping slaves and heard their stories, and then began to pen the horrors of slavery for the rest of the world to read in a novel format, of families ripped apart, of people persecuted and abused. And her work, Uncle Tom's Cabin, sold, check this out, 300,000 copies in its first year alone. It went on to become the best-selling novel of the 19th century, the best-selling book other than the Bible, I believe, outdoing Dickens by a long shot, who was remarkably popular. So that was her work. A later one, of course, was Dread, the tale of the Great Swamp. Is it? The Great Deep Swamp, which also, that's in 1859, that's against slavery in the South as well. The apocryphal comment about Harriet Beecher Stowe is that Abraham Lincoln met this diminutive woman and said to her, "So you're the little lady who started this war." Not true, but nonetheless captures actually the influence of Harriet Beecher Stowe's writing in Uncle Tom's Cabin. And she continued long after as well, going around the northern states. She would, using story as a means to evoke morality in people's breast, and as a form of political persuasion, and sort of introduces the idea of the author as public intellectual. And regarding just the impact of an author's writing, did anyone of any background, any gender, write anything as influential as Uncle Tom's Cabin? That's hard to say, isn't it? But nonetheless, I think you understand why Harriet Beecher Stowe is on this list. In 18th place is a writer many of you have asked me to read and review, and I really do need to get round to it, to be quite honest. So this is going on my wish list as well. Near to the Wild Heart was the debut novel of this writer, and it is Clarice Lispector, the Ukrainian-Brazilian writer. Some call Lispector the Virginia Woolf of Brazil, because Near to the Wild Heart shocked the whole literary scene in Brazil because of its stream of consciousness, following the internal monologues of, is it Joanna, the protagonist in that book, from birth or infancy all the way to growing up, and beyond. And that was just the start with this stream of consciousness idea. She later writes other works. The one that's been recommended to me the most is Agua Viva, which somewhat goes into a bit philosophical style, apparently. Lispector refers to the inner self as like a living organism in its own right. I love that concept because I don't know if you ever get that sense when you're walking around that there's a you inside you that has a living, breathing life of its own. She also hosted salons. She was a journalist. She wrote cooking recipes and has had a massive effect. When I've asked people for recommendations for South American authors, Machado de Assis has come up as the great Brazilian author, but Lispector is always mentioned when I ask for recommendations for South American writers. So that's number 18, Clarice Lispector. In 19th place is an absolute literary giant, and it is George Eliot, or Mary Ann Evans. Eliot, I think you could argue Eliot is the greatest English novelist ever. I know plenty would adhere to that title. I mean, sort of at the forefront of the realist movement. Her works, just the character studies of her works, the scope of her works. Yes, a lot of her works are, perfect for weighing down a body in a lake, You think of Middlemarch, it has 12 protagonists, really, isn't it? Is it Dorothea Brooke, and you've got Dr. Lydgate? The things that you've got her analysing, like medical ethics, provincialism, snobbery, classism, prejudice. There's so much. She harkens on about spiritual redemption in Silas Marner. She harkens for the old age, the recognising of a passing world in Silas Marner as well. How she portrays the Jewish identity in England in the 1870s, or in the 19th century at least. Her ability to juggle such ambitious plots, a massive amount of people in her cast, to focus in on the ordinary and the mundane, to capture scenery, to capture actual group collective ideals together and individuals who stand out, merging it all with her own upbringing. It's just, she changed literature. So many people would follow what Eliot did. No one individually starts a movement. Movements tend to just begin to emerge. But when you get writers like Eliot, their works come on the scene and other writers think, wow, that's a great way of writing. And, if you talk about realism, Eliot's right there with Flaubert. Those two together may be the two most influential writers in changing the novel from the 19th century form into what we now recognise as a novel. And so George Eliot is she has to be on this list because she may be one of the most influential writers ever. The 20th and final writer on this list of great women authors is the second one to ever win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1926 it was, and it's Grazia Deledda. She's born in Sardinia, and it was said of her writing that it was this idealistically inspired writing that captured her native homeland and the villages and the people. Deledda, like many others before, this is very interesting, was someone who used to gather myths and folklore together, and from them wove bigger stories about love and honour and community and travail. Elias Portaloo is maybe her most famous work, which tracks the story of a Sardinian fisherman in his local community torn between duty and passion. Something that's said about Deledda's writing is that it's very emotional. It gives high detail of places, and the characters, they have a strong sense. Their character is tied very much to their love of the place that they were born and live. And this factors in through all the stories. And of course, that's particularly powerful when you think of an island people, because you do tend to have a stronger sense of character in that respects. She influenced other modernist writers going forward, including Verga, who, if you've read House Beneath the Medlar Tree, or House of the Medlar Tree, it's a really good story, by the way. I highly recommend that. I'm just thinking now how you exactly call its name. I think it's The House by the Medlar Tree. He was very moved and influenced by Deledda, and that's a masterful story. So that's the last one on this list. Grazia Deledda, the Sardinian writer, second winner, a female winner of the Literary Prize, Nobel Prize in 1926. I hope you enjoyed this list of 20 great female authors. Of course, there are way more than that, and I could do this list all over again. I hope you found some new ones in here that intrigue you. I know through my research, which took a long time, I've found some, and I'm really intrigued. I've got a few on my wish list which have jumped to the top of others that I want to read because they sound that good. So until the next time, I wish you joy in whatever you read.